everyone. Welcome back to the Concussion Discussions series brought to you by Integrated Brain Centers. I am your host, Amy Zellmer from Faces of TBI, and today I am talking with Dr. Dale Bredesen about neurodegeneration. So, Dr. Bredesen, so excited to have you here. Such an important subject, especially for anyone, not just someone who's had a brain injury. So thrilled to have you here today.
Thanks so much for having me, Amy. I appreciate it.
So your specialty is in Alzheimer's, and you have two books on the End of Alzheimer's and the End of Alzheimer's program. So you have developed this amazing program to help people who are in, neurodecline, and ways to help people prevent neurodecline. And you've dubbed the term I'm going to say it wrong, Cognoscopy.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about what that is. I love that term. It grabs your attention.
Yes, and certainly people have said, don't use that term. It sounds so crazy. But the idea is simple, that, we all recognize when we turn 50, we are supposed to get a colonoscopy. And of course, with all the recent discussion about unfortunate Chadwick Boseman, people are talking about moving it early. We should move it to 45 or 40. And of course, he was affected in his late 30s. Certainly everybody realizes this is an important thing. And we've gone, the same way with things like mammography and pap smears. The future is all about prevention. And yet what happens is cognitive decline sneaks up on us, no question about it. And we've seen a number of people who came for prevention, who turned out when we evaluated them already to be in the earliest throes of Alzheimer's disease. So we recommend that anybody who's 45 years of age or older get a cognoscopy. It's an easy thing to remember, and it's actually easy to do. You can actually go on to mycognoscopy.com and get it. So what you want to do is, it's just three things, and I mentioned this in the book. So number one, you want to have a series of blood tests that are telling you the critical things that unfortunately most doctors aren't checking. You want to know if you have ongoing systemic inflammation, obviously critical if you've had head injury or not. You want to know if you have glycotoxicity, if you've got insulin resistance, if you've got ongoing exposure to various toxins, if you've got reduced production or reduced levels of critical nutrients like vitamin D, like omega-3s and things like that. So you want to know this set of things because those are the things that are actually supporting your brain or that are threats for your brain. You need to do that. Second piece of the cognoscopy is simple. It's about a 30-minute online cognitive assessment just to make sure that everything's going okay up here. And again, it sneaks up on you. That's been one of the problems. And unfortunately, it's been backwards. The doctors have said, well, there's nothing we can do about it anyway, so don't worry about coming in early, just come in whenever, because we can't do anything anyway. Nothing could be further from the truth. There's tremendous amount we can do about it. We've proven this. We published the first paper to show reversal of Alzheimer's disease symptoms, reversal of cognitive decline back in 2014, more in 2016, and then in 2018, we published 100 documented cases of reversal of cognitive decline. So that's part two. And then part three is simple. If you don't have any symptoms and you're doing great, you don't need the third part, which is an MRI. But if you do have symptoms, or if you are struggling, then you want to make sure to include an MRI with volumetrics. That's the key. So you want to know whether you have any atrophy, any shrinkage in your hippocampus, for example, or in other regions of your brain that are associated with Alzheimer's disease, because we now know that Alzheimer's starts about 20 years before a diagnosis. Yeah. So even though we used to think about it as a disease of your 60s, 70s, or 80s, it's really a disease of your 40s, 50s, and 60s that is diagnosed 20 years after that.
Mm-hmm. And, so what about the relationship between concussion and Alzheimer's? We are often told that we are more at risk of developing Alzheimer's and dementia, and they're definitely in that same spectrum of inflammation. Yeah. So, what are your thoughts on that?
unquestionably, there is, and that's been published repeatedly, there is an increased risk for Alzheimer's disease with head trauma. And of course, there's also increased risk for the CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And these are essentially cousins. I mean, chronic traumatic encephalopathy is a tauopathy. Tau is spread through the brain without the amyloid. Alzheimer's has both, has the amyloid and the tau. So basically, if you're relatively young and you're able to clear the amyloid, you end up with the tau. We call it CTE. But these are all related. These are neurodegenerative processes that feature the molecule tau, which is the thing that normally is actually, it's like bolts. It's helping it so that your microtubules can extend and be supported. And so this is now popped out when you're pulling back. So when you have trauma, you're literally pulling back on all these connections, or you have Alzheimer's and you're pulling back on these connections. The tau is phosphorylated and popped off, just like you'd pull apart, your extension on your home so that you can now collapse things back in. So that's what it's showing you. So absolutely, we looked a number of years ago and published back in 2015 that there are different subtypes of Alzheimer's. And subtype 5 is traumatic. And so no question, this increases your risk. So type 1 is inflammatory. Type 2 is atrophic. If you don't have enough support for that tremendous neural network that's inside your skull, then in fact, you are going to start downsizing. That's really what's happening in Alzheimer's disease. And the same thing with TBI, of course. And then type 1.5 is glycotoxic. This is with people who have insulin resistance. And we call it 1.5 because it has both some inflammation and some atrophic effects. And then type 3 is toxic. And the toxins come in 3 different types. You've got toxins that are metals and other inorganics, things like air pollution. And out here, we're having all sorts of fires. This is increasing our risk for future Alzheimer's disease. Second one is organic toxins, things like formaldehyde and benzene and toluene and glyphosate, things like that. And the third one then is biotoxins. When you're exposed to specific molds, they're producing toxins because they're trying to kill bacteria so they can live in the same biological niche. Unfortunately, these toxins also hurt our brains. They damage our immune systems. They increase our risk for cancer. They decrease our kidney function. So these things can be very toxic, and people typically aren't checking. And then type 4 is vascular. Obviously, vascular support of the brain, huge. So absolutely traumatic is something. And I should say, when we see people who have traumatic related Alzheimer's, they often have that triad that you see with CTE. So the triad is aggression, depression, and dementia. If you think about it, your brain is responding programmatically. It's saying, I've been struck, I've been hit, and therefore, if there's any question, if I'm in any threat, I'm going to lash out, I'm going to strike out to defend myself. And so you get this combination of the aggression along with the depression, along with the dementia, when you have people who have traumatic related Alzheimer's or traumatic related cognitive decline.
Yeah. And that makes sense to me because, those are symptoms we see after brain injury as well. So Totally makes sense to me. Yeah. So let's back up a little bit and talk a little more about, you do extensive blood testing, and you're also checking for molds, other toxins, heavy metals. What is that telling us, or telling you, I should ask?
It's a great point. And why do we do all these tests? So we spent 30 years in the laboratory because the area of greatest biomedical therapeutic failure is the area of neurodegeneration. Everyone says everyone knows a cancer survivor, but no one knows an Alzheimer's survivor. And so the idea was, could we understand the fundamental nature? What are the molecular underpinnings of the neurodegenerative process? And over the years, we studied this, published over 200 papers on looking at can we get the inner workings of this? And this is, as you said, very relevant for brain injury related cognitive decline, because as you know, that is a progressive process. It doesn't just stop once, it actually progresses over time. So what we found is that there's this amazing molecular switch that sits in your neurons. This is called amyloid precursor protein, a molecule. It's the thing that gives rise to the amyloid. It's the parent of the amyloid that you see in Alzheimer's disease. When things are good, when you've got plenty of support, vitamins, hormones, growth factors, no inflammation, all the good things, not trauma, all this stuff, then this APP is cut at a single site to give you two pieces, two peptides, one that's outside the cell, one that's inside the cell. And what this does is it tells you things are good. Go ahead, make new connections, make memories, make synapses, keep your synapses, all that sort of stuff. You can afford to do that. No different than a country would decide or a company would decide. And on the other hand, when things are bad, you have trauma, you have inflammation, you have reduced support, you have insulin resistance, you have ongoing inflammation. This same molecule is now cut at 3 different sites called the beta, gamma, and caspase sites. Now you have 4 pieces, 2 for outside, 2 for inside, and these are now saying, we are under attack. We have to respond to insult. And so to respond to that insult, you're making things that are basically killing the insult. So for example, the amyloid that we associate with Alzheimer's is a good antimicrobial. It is killing bacteria that often come from your mouth into your brain or from your sinuses into your brain. It is killing the bacteria. It is killing the fungi. It's killing the viruses. So it's very much like what's happened to our country with COVID-19. So what happened with COVID-19? We were all told, get inside, shelter in place, social distance. So we did that, and what has happened? We have entered a recession. There's less going on. There's less interaction. There's less commerce. That's the same thing that your brain is doing. It's responding to these various insults by saying, uh-oh, pull back because we are under attack. We're going to have to fight the attack, but we're going to have to downsize our brains. Now, as you can imagine, if you don't check the right things, you just continue to downsize, downsize, downsize. But if you can identify those factors and you can begin to rebuild and get rid of what's giving you the insult, then you can actually do quite well. And so that's why we want to check these various things and look at what's actually driving the process. That's the key.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what are some things, if we've identified that there's still a lot of inflammation going on, which is actually incredibly common after brain injury? I think
Right.
the reason most people's symptoms linger is because they've got that inflammation going on. So what are some things we can do to now treat this and hopefully reduce this?
Yeah, that's a great point. So the good news is that the armamentarium in Alzheimer's disease is actually huge. So in fact, you can address the various toxins, you can address the various pathogens, and we typically find in someone who's having cognitive decline, many different contributors, typically between 10 and 25 different contributors. So as you mentioned, even though people may have a history of head trauma, they often have multiple other things contributing as well. And there's no question, there's clear evidence, published evidence, that people with TBI can get improvement with things like anti-inflammation, high doses of omega-3s, for example, vitamin D, vinpocetine, things like this. And by the way, in the last few years, there's now resolvins that weren't available before. And Professor Charles Sirhan from Harvard has done elegant studies on these resolvins, and you can now resolve. So there are really 2 parts of inflammation. There's one preventing it, what we call anti-inflammatories, but there's also resolution of the inflammation, resolving the inflammation, which you can do with these so-called SPMs or resolvins that help to resolve that inflammation. You also want to know, what is your omega-3 index? For so many of us, we are in a mildly pro-inflammatory state. And that has to do with just living in the West, Western cultures. It has to do with the food we eat. It has to do with the fact that so many of us have a leaky gut. It has to do with many of us have metabolic syndrome. It has to do with the fact that many of us have so-called leaky gums. So a little gingivitis or periodontitis or chronic sinusitis. All of these things can contribute to a mildly pro-inflammatory state. As you know, they contribute to aging. They contribute to other chronic illnesses such as hypertension and heart disease, and they also contribute to cognitive decline, and including with brain injury. So it's critical to know, you want to know what your status is with your omega-3s. Also helpful to know your omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, and then also helpful to know whether your HSCRP is increased. This is your high sensitivity C-reactive protein, which is also telling you, do you have ongoing systemic inflammation? All of these things are helpful to know. So we really can get a much better look at where things stand. And as you know, there's also been a whole movement on quantified self. So there's so many of these things that we can now do. We can check, for example, our glucose over time. We can check our ketone levels. We can check our heart rate variability. Of course, we can check our blood pressure. We can check our sleep status. Are we getting enough sleep? What about the different phases of sleep? I mean, there are all sorts of things. We can check our gut microbiomes. So there's a lot that we can do that we couldn't do even 5 years ago, that really gives us a better look at what's going on.
Mm-hmm. And I know that you definitely promote the keto diet lifestyle as a pro-healthy, getting rid of inflammation. Let's talk a little bit about that, because I know there's a lot of differing information out there about leaky gut, right? And I know I've heard repeatedly, the keto diet is one of the best diets to do for brain health. So I would love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, and certainly, I'm not a nutritionist. So all we're doing is we're going by what's the biochemistry that helps you on the right side of that switch I talked about earlier,
Mm-hmm.
to make and keep synapses. What are the things that signal that? And it is having enough hormones and enough growth factors and enough nutrients. But when you get down to, okay, what is the diet? What can you put into your body that supports that process? Then, in fact, it does turn out that a couple things are critical here. And I should say, when I talk about ketogenic diet, I'm not talking about bacon. I'm talking specifically about, as I mentioned in the book, we call it KetoFlex 12-3. It's a plant-rich ketogenic diet, mildly ketogenic, and we call it KetoFlex 12-3. And here's how it works. So first of all, when you have cognitive decline, you really have an energy gap. And it's very clear in Alzheimer's, because you can see a decrease in glucose utilization by the brain in the temporal and parietal regions. So this is really telling you, hey, you don't have enough energy there. So you need the blood flow, you need the oxygen, and many people are low in oxygen at night. Please get that checked. If you're dropping your oxygenation at night, it's not good for a traumatized brain. It's not good for an Alzheimer's brain. It's not good for any of our brains. And in fact, there's a nice paper showing your oxygenation at night, if it's dropping, correlates with your brain volume. And so specific nuclei within the brain shrink if your oxygen is low. And so many people just haven't checked it to see. So that's huge. And then we want to have people get into mild ketosis, 1.0 to 4.0 millimolar beta hydroxybutyrate, or if you prefer a breathalyzer like Biosense, then you want to get above 7 on what's called ACEs, which is measuring acetone, and preferably above 10 at least sometimes during the day. And so you do this by having a plant-rich, as I mentioned, high fats, intermediate protein, low carbohydrate, and hopefully zero simple carbs diet. So as you're now burning the fat and producing the ketones that turn out to be critical for bridging that gap. You want to make it so that your brain is able to respond to the glucose and also to the ketones. You're not eating glucose directly, but that's breaking down from your more complex carbohydrates. And then you want to make sure that when you have this, by the way, just the polyphenols alone that are in some of the vegetables, these things are shown to improve brain structure and function and support function. So then also you want to make sure that you have the fiber that is critical. So you're getting fiber. Our ancestors probably ate, it's estimated, around 100 grams of fiber a day. Many of us are now eating 5 or 10 grams of fiber a day. So we like to get people up to 30 grams or more. And you can do this with salads, with celery, with all sorts of different things. And then I like to take organic psyllium husk, easy to do, gives you a little extra fiber. Some people like to take konjac root, that's fine too. Whatever you like, there are lots of ways to go to get that same effect, to give yourself some good fiber, and that does support your gut microbiome as well. So the idea of KetoFlex is drive yourself into mild ketosis. And at the beginning, we recommend people just take some ketones because that helps to get that up. In the long run, there are advantages to doing it endogenously. Then the second piece, flex. If you want to be a vegetarian, fine. If you don't want to be a vegetarian, fine. Either way, if you're going to have meat, fine. Have fish, the smashed fish, salmon, mackerel, anchovies, sardines, herring, the little guys that give you the omega-3s, much more that don't give you the mercury. Have some grass-fed beef, it's wonderful. Have some pastured chicken, have some pastured eggs, those are all fine. And then, I like to follow myself on Chronometer. It's free, it's easy to do, and you can look at all your different nutrients and see where you're light. And by the way, most of us are light in choline. Choline, critical for memory formation because it's a precursor to acetylcholine. So it's a concern if you have Alzheimer's. It's a concern if you have cognitive decline associated with trauma as well. So make sure you're getting around 550 milligrams of choline per day because most of us aren't getting enough. And then 12-3, it's 12/3, minimum of 12-hour fast between finishing your dinner and starting your breakfast, brunch, or lunch. And if you're ApoE4 positive, go up to 14 to 16 hours. And I'm sure you've talked about ApoE4 because it's so critical in outcome from head trauma as well. And then it's 12/3 because you want at least 3 hours between finishing your last meal and then going to bed. So KetoFlex 12/3, and we talk about it extensively in all the pieces and how to do it best and all the various workarounds and all of these things in the book.
Yeah. And that's in the End of Alzheimer's program, correct?
Yes, because the first book that we published back in 2017 is actually now available in 32 languages, The End of Alzheimer's. And it was really more about the science and about here's how we can do it. Here's what people need to do. But a lot of people said, we want more detail. What are the websites we go to? Where do we go? How do we get these things? What are the workarounds? What are some things that people have done that has helped them, that tricks they've learned along the way? So this new one, we actually have inside the new book a specific handbook, and I worked with 2 other people to get a real complementary. So we've got the science part. My wife, who is an integrative physician, provides the clinical part, and then Julie G, who's a wonderful woman who started a website, apoe4.info, is herself ApoE44, had early changes of Alzheimer's with early symptoms and has done exceedingly well and has gone from 35th percentile to 98th percentile, just doing absolutely beautifully. So anyway, all those, the 3 of us work together to get the right things.
And just everyone watching, I do have that link below the video here, so you can click on that. And Dr. Dale Bredesen, thank you so much for being here. This has been such a great conversation, such important information. And if people want to find you, you have several websites. You have drbredesen.com. You have mycognoscopy.com and myprecode.com. And we'll have all of those linked below the video for you guys watching. And you can follow him on Instagram at Dr. Dale Bredesen as well. So thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure chatting with you today.
Thanks so much, Amy. And please, everybody, get on prevention. That's what Precode is all about. And let's make Alzheimer's a rare disease, and let's make CTE a rare disease.